And here we are at Module 7. And this module, we're going to look at some of the research horizons in the field of restorative justice. And this ties in many ways quite closely with last week's work, where we looked at what the current big issues were. But here we're looking at how they translate into a research agenda, and I guess this is sort of an up-to-the-minute look at what's happening in the field, because we've been through very many years of questions of, does it work, doesn't it work, what are the pros and cons, and we've got a pretty good understanding that overall restorative justice processes work better than the existing criminal justice system. And there are some fields that it doesn't work in. We've got a bit more nuance to find out, but the research agenda has shifted significantly away from that question of does it work, because largely we have the answer that it does. So the sort of questions that we're asking now, and we're going to look at three of those sort of main questions in this video, is first of all, where do we stand in terms of institutionalization of restorative justice ideas? I mean, it's been presented for 30 years or so as, an innovation, an outlier, as something external to the system. But we now have a situation where it's becoming increasingly connected as a core part of the system, as part of the institution. What does that mean? What are the dangers? What are lost? What's gained from that process? So the first field we're going to look at is institutionalization. The second we're going to look at is where are we at in terms of adult offenders and serious offences, because that's a lot of the focus has really been on young offenders. So what do we now know about the role of this approach for serious offenders, for adult offenders? And the third question is, how does the process work? What is the actual detailed mechanism? I mean, we know from victim surveys, this broad sense of satisfaction in terms of having your voice heard and whatever. But what is actually going on there? What is the actual underlying process? And is this something that particularly brain chemistry, brain science can help us understand in a way that we haven't understood before? So we'll look at each of those in turn, and we'll have a bit of an overview of where research is at the moment. So the first concept is the institutionalization. What happens when you've got something that's gone from being a exciting new innovation that everyone's talking about, and what happens, how do we actually embed it in existing systems, and what are the dangers of doing that? What do we lose things from that process? So, many of the different justice programs that have existed previously have been voluntary things that have sat entirely outside of the justice system. And there have been things that have been voluntarily used, particularly victim offender mediation, where both parties have been through the justice system and have agreed to come back and go through this process. Then we've increasingly seen the annexation of these processes to the conventional system, where if you get particularly where there is a plea of guilty and you have a referral to a restorative justice process. And now we're looking at, particularly in youth justice, in areas where this has become, has become part of the system. It's what we do. Now there are two different issues in terms of co-opting this different idea and different approach within an existing system. And these we'll talk about in terms of conceptual co-option and administrative co-option. So obviously restorative justice is based on a really different set of ideas, philosophies, principles than the conventional justice system. Also, the conventional justice system is much more powerful, it's much more entrenched. So how do you get those, to what extent do those ideas transfer into the new system, and to what extent do they get their sharp edges knocked off or blunted or changed to accommodate the conventional way of thinking by the traditional justice system? And I think I've referred to this several times before, but when we look at how family mediation was introduced into Australian family law, we definitely saw a reduction of efficiency, but we also saw a removal of the whole philosophy and idea behind family mediation to be replaced by this sort of logic of justice and the logic of the legal system. And the legal system isn't the most accommodating of new ideas, and quite often feels threatened by new ideas. So often we see a situation where it's like, well, we'll take what we want from these ideas and innovations, but we'll make sure it's changed, or make sure it's modified so that it really suits our purposes and that it's consistent with our worldview. So this is the first form of co-opting that we're concerned about, and that's that conceptual co-opting. Now, there are different goals for restorative justice, and there are certainly advantages to the integration within a system. So it's not like it's just like this bigger system just gobbling up these other ideas. There's definitely advantages to having restorative justice processes formally part of the system. It means it's backed up by legislation. It means its funding is more secure. It means there are also legal safeguards that can be extended that couldn't be extended in any other ways. So there are lots of benefits, but there is that danger of losing that philosophy and losing that character. Now, the existing system has been long set up under its own goals, and they're very much offender focused. They're about deterring an offender, about deterring prospective offenders, they're about rehabilitation, and they're also about issues of retribution to a certain extent. There's still the remains of that old way of thinking in the justice system, of just deserts, of giving making the punishment fit the crime and all those sort of things. Now, those ideas are not going anywhere anytime soon, and the ideas of restorative justice, which is victim-centric and looks at the need of the victim, isn't a very close match. So what we've been finding, and this is where we need more research definitely, is that there tends to be a sense of accommodation, of tolerance of this different process, but not an embrace of its ideas. And at some point we'll look at the Community Justice Centre in Collingwood in Victoria, and it's been extremely successful, and that's part of that is because there's been a magistrate running the program who is very supportive of the program and who is very much in line with the principles of restorative justice. And there's been amazing success in terms of reduction of crime rates across the area. So not just in terms of the individuals not reoffending, there's been a substantial reduction in crime in the area that the program serves. But there's also been a massive backlash from the general community of magistrates in the state, and a lot of political opposition, partially because they're not very happy that another magistrate's being held up as the golden child who's got this program that's working really effectively. There's a certain amount of professional jealousy involved, but there's also a sense of resistance to change. So one of the big difficulties is not just political change in terms of the government and the population, but in terms of the resistance that comes from within an existing system, and magistrates saying, we're already working really long hours, we're already overworked, we don't have time to think about these new ideas, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's one of those big dangers is that that conceptual co-opting, and again remove victims being basically pushed back into the same position they've always been in the system as this peripheral part of the process. The other form of co-option that we're concerned about is what's called administrative co-option, and that's just the practicalities of running these programs alongside existing justice processes. So where in isolation a restorative justice program can run on its own timetable, and do things in its own time, and particular can do things like prepare participants, can have a longer lead time in terms of preparation. They can have longer follow-ups. They can have more flexibility in terms of the time taken to reach agreement and those sort of things. As soon as they become part of the system, they become part of the pressures of that system. So what often happens, I mean, the systems are all different, just to confuse everyone, but what often happens is before sentencing, a magistrate may refer an offender, particularly one who has pleaded guilty, to a restorative justice process before they're brought back to the magistrate and sentencing is considered. And that means suddenly there's an enormous time pressure on the restorative part of the process to be complete in time for the sentencing done by the magistrate. So just the technicalities of actually getting things done, and we'll come to one of the last thing that we'll talk about today is about the importance of more understanding of the preparatory process that goes on. We do have a situation where suddenly you're part of what's often been called the sausage factory of the justice system. It's overworked, understaffed, and magistrates' courts are literally just put the next offender through, bang, put the next offender through, bang. They very are a factory approach to justice. And that may not give the restorative programs enough time to function. So it's not about the conceptual or philosophy clash, but it's just about the being able to adapt to the speed of the current system. And you can get a combination of these factors where you've got gatekeepers, where you've got judges, prosecutors, magistrates, police, who are required to refer people to restorative justice programs. And they have a combination of both resistance philosophically to this approach, but also an understanding that they don't have the time. There isn't the time in the processes to allow for these sorts of programs, even if they're hugely successful. We have to still keeping the offenders moving through the system, even if that means we deal them in a way that's fairly perfunctory and just sends them out to become effective to re-offend. And this is one of the paradoxes of the justice system, is it's meeting so many different objectives, and money and resources is one of the most compelling ones. You can only do with the resources you're given, and often you are not going to get the political will to get the resources you need to do the job properly. All right, the second topic I want to talk about, this one's more briefly, because I want to identify it as an area of research, but to also identify that there's not been much research done, is adult offenders and serious crime. So we've had a lot of success with young offenders, had a lot of success with relatively minor forms of crime. How effective are these processes with older offenders who may already be hardened into a particular perspective, a particular worldview, a particular criminal career? And how effective are they with more serious offences? How effective are they with homicide? I mean, obviously, victim-offender mediation doesn't work that well with homicide, but often you'll have conferencing can work with homicide, where you have family members standing in the place. The family members are the victims of the crime. And some of these have been quite successful, because not all homicides are crazed murderers that are going out, to cruelly and deliberately kill people. Quite often homicides occur, and remember, this includes manslaughter. This is non-deliberate homicide, where people being stupid or neglectful or just doing the wrong thing by cutting corners. And in those cases, they're very suitable for restorative justice processes, because something quite terrible has happened, but it's not been something that's been done deliberately. It's been something that's been done carelessly. It's been done so carelessly that the person should have been able to see it coming, should have known that it was a danger, but it's still quite different to someone who sets out to kill someone deliberately. So again, there's not a lot of work being done in that area. New Zealand is much further ahead there, but there's still not, because homicides are so rare anyway, comparatively rare, that we haven't had a lot of opportunities, but we want to flag that as something that is interesting to have a look at. Another area that's emerged that's become interesting that needs more research is hate crimes. Again, to start with, there's, I guess, a resistance to using restorative justice in hate crimes because of a belief that these are crimes based on prejudice, and prejudice is ingrained and hard to alter. And therefore there's a power imbalance, and a victim of a hate crime who has to face the offender is much more likely to be re-victimised, to be further victimised. I'm not convinced about that, and neither are many of researchers, because I think prejudice is often based on ignorance, and forcing an offender to confront their own ignorance and to confront actual people who have been victims of what they've done, rather than the fictional versions of victims they have in their mind with their conspiracy theories and their, the racist or prejudiced beliefs that they've accepted through their childhood. There's a really strong potential of restorative justice to actually transform these people, to actually have them look and say, actually, everything I believed that I just didn't challenge about my beliefs are actually quite wrong, and to actually see a significant improvement. And there are plenty of examples of people who are former racist skinheads, former racist militia members, former members of racist hate groups, who have had that moment of realisation, have realised how faulty their beliefs are from one way or another, and are now activists and are working hard to try and dismantle those sort of beliefs. So again, there's not a lot of work, it's not been done very often, and there's not a lot of examples to draw on, but this is certainly an area where we are seeing a need for more research, and we're seeing emerging research in the area of what can we do in terms of hate crime and restorative justice. The last of the topics for today is the research on the how does it work rather than does it work. Again, we've got about 30 years of research that's pretty reliable in terms of victims are more satisfied with the process, offenders have either have really good rates of desistance, or at least better than the conventional criminal justice system. So even where restorative justice hasn't been as successful as we'd like it to be, it's still miles ahead of your conventional courts and magistrates. So there's a point where, do we need to keep doing this research? Do we need to keep producing more and more research that says, yes, it works, yes, people are satisfied, yes, there's impact on the crime rates? And there's been a turn comparatively recently towards understanding the mechanics of how it actually works. So, for instance, the work of Van Camp and Vemmers, which is in 2013, the early 2010s, started unpacking what satisfaction actually means, trying to understand what are the components of satisfaction. And they found that there were factors including voice, respect, trust, neutrality, that were things that victims felt were very important. And when they analysed all these factors, they said it's actually about the fairness of the process, that the satisfaction actually comes from an evaluation of the process of respect and of procedural justice, of understanding that the process is fairer than what they were expecting or what they were used to. So that was an interesting piece of research, and they also found that there were things that could be done through restorative justice that just can't be done under the standard processes, such as providing care for the victims, meeting the needs of the victims, getting the offenders to provide answers to the victims, like, why did you pick me? Why did you do what you did? So there are a lot of situations in which the satisfaction is built not just on a general sense of well-being, but on specific aspects of the process. There's also been work in neuroscience and psychology. As recently as 2017, Bolitho looked at the theory of memory reconsolidation and what that means for emotional restoration, and actually found that there was physiological changes that came through restoration. And because we're always rewriting memories, and modern theory around memory is that memory isn't like a recording that we have, and that we know it degrades over time, but it's this recording we go back to. Modern neuroscience is telling us that every time we access a memory, we're writing it, we're creating it again. This has created substantial problems for the ideas of witness testimony, because the more you tell a story, the more you'll believe the new version of the story, and you'll remember the version that you told. Anyway, neuroscience is weird, but absolutely fascinating. But they've actually looked at the fact that the restorative justice, Bolitho's research at least, has looked at the role of restorative justice in being able to rewrite more positive, more empowering versions of memories for victims. So it's not even like that they just feel better or they feel empowered out of the process, but they're actually creating memories of the event, of the victimization, that are healthier for them. It doesn't mean they'll suddenly, misremember a terrible event as something that was lovely that happened to them. It's not quite that simple, but it does mean that if you sit and obsess and revisit which happens with PTSD, if you keep revisiting the trauma that happens, you're going to be rewriting this more and more traumatic, worse and worse version of the events as time goes on. Whereas the restorative processes will actually help balance that out and stop that process of just this continuing worsening of the memory. And the last piece of area of research I want to briefly talk about in terms of how it works has really focused on the role of preparation and the role of the holistic context of restorative justice. So it's not just about the hour or so where we have the conference, it's about all the preparation that happens beforehand, how that helps the victim, how it helps the offender, and all the debriefing and everything that happens afterwards. So this is largely the work of Masahiro Suzuki, who wrote these materials. My great friend and colleague Masahiro, who's now moved on to another university, but he's pretty much a world leader in this field, and beginning to say we can't just look at what happens within the particular session. We've got to look more broadly, and if victims are feeling better and more respected, more listened to, it's not just because the hour that they sat in that conference, but it's all those proceedings that lead up to it, and it's all the proceedings that lead over it. So that again is something that we're becoming more interested in, is saying, well, and this we'll come back to this when we look at it in a couple of weeks' time, the idea of therapeutic jurisprudence, with this idea that it's about the whole process, and that we can do a lot more good either side of the process to actually improve outcomes than rather just focusing on that narrow part of the process itself. So yes, we'll come back to that when we look at therapeutic jurisprudence and the idea that we take a victim-centered medical approach to understanding the victim's needs in these sort of procedures.